Aloha, I'm Sarah Maisel, and I'm very excited to be here with you through Ukulele Magazine. Now, I kind of want to go over some of the different concepts that I talked about in the article. And one thing about this is the whole point of this jam article is to be able to, make your jams not necessarily fun again, but it gives you another way to practice the things that have already been discussed in this magazine multiple times. I cite different articles just to remind you that, this is all information that's been brought forth before. Now, how do we actually utilize it in order to be able to make your jam more fun, and to be able to just make the jam something where you're learning and playing at the same time? So one of the very first things that I mentioned is playing your chords in a new place, right? Like, take the time, and if there's a C chord, for example, instead of playing C where you know and love it, looking at example number 1, you could absolutely play it in a new place. You could first try doing open 4, 3, and 3. To me, this voicing sounds better on a high G than a low G, but it still works. If you want to make it a little more low G friendly, I would add your ring finger to the 5th fret. So it's 5, 4, 4, and 5, 4, 3, 3. Anytime there's a C chord that happens in any of the songs, you can play this, or if you already know this inversion, go to the next one. You'll notice that the next one I have written, you're going to be barring the 7th fret, and you're going to make what looks like F underneath it. So you're going to be holding you're going to be holding 9, 7, 8, and 7. That is another C chord. Sounds great. This is a low G friendly version. If you want to be able to do one that's a little more high, that I think works better for high G, but again, you can still play it low G, you're going to form what looks like a G chord on the 7th fret. So it's open 7, 8, 7. All of these you could play instead of open, open, open 3, right? C. And it'll sound great with your neighbor. And yes, you're going to feel like you're jumping around your fretboard a bit as you play the other chords where you know and love them. Part of this exercise of just choosing one chord to change in your jam is making it so that you can still survive the rest of the jam. Once you're feeling comfortable and confident with one new chord, throw in another one. You could always play G7, right? Down here, you could play G7 in another place. I could either do this version, which is open 5, 3, 5, right? Or I could play the sort of more low G friendly version, which is me holding the 3rd fret with my index, and I'm holding 4, 5, 3, 5, right? And in doing this, I now have G7 here, or G7 like that, or G7 like this, and I could keep moving it up the neck if I wanted, but that would be potentially the next chord I might use, because G7 tends to happen right before a C. So it's another just nifty one to be able to add to your arsenal. The other thing that I also like to point out too is once you start playing these chords in different places, you can start to sort of pass through them. What I have as my example with that is in example number 2 with G7 specifically, I'm holding a standard G7 chord, and then I'm going to I can either add my pinky, which is what I probably will do, to that 3rd fret of my A string. You could also just move up your ring finger too, if you would rather do it that way, but you're just, no matter what you do, you're holding open 2, 1, and 3. Right? So you've got this, and then you can move up to either open 5, 3, 5, or 4, 5, 3, and 5. Either one's fine. I'll do it where I'm going to go to the open G string version. So I'm holding G7, moving up my ring, and then moving up to Craig likes to call this giant G7, because it's a lot like G7, but your fingers are spread out. And I could go backward, move it all down, and move that finger back. Or if I'm wanting to do it closed, I could do G7, add my pinky, and And then what's going to end up happening is my ring and my pinky are going to slide up, whoop, and stay the same amount apart. So now my index is on the 3rd fret, my pinky is on the 5th, and I'm going to add the rest of the fingers to make that G7, 4, 5, 3, and 5. So again, walking through it, G7, add the pinky, scoot up, G7, and I can go back down. So let's say I have a G7 happening for a long time, maybe 8 beats. Again, G7, and back down. You can move in between, and what I'm technically doing is adding a note to my G7. Technically, that's a note found in my G7 scale that's making this now a suspended chord. But I'm just using that note to help me pass from one position to the next. And it's a great way of doing this with some musicality. So I'm not just going G7, right, just bouncing around. It actually shows that I'm thinking ahead and moving forward and creating a little passing chord, if you will, moving me from one position to the next. And that's sort of a next step thing that you can add, particularly, again, when you're on a chord for a really long time, which can happen in many of the songs that we play. So just something to keep in mind when you're doing that. And you can do that with any kind of chord. I have another example. Example number 3, if I'm holding an F chord, right? I can always add my pinky and then move up to the 5th fret. And that's another way of moving in between some F chords, right? So going F, add a friend. And if I wanted to be extra, I could actually add my pinky, which is not written down. What I'm holding here is 5, 5, 5, and 8, right? I could totally hold, this is another F chord. If you're more comfortable holding it with your index, I was barring it with my middle and then stretching my pinky, but you could always just bar with your index on that. And that also works too. Again, me just having to hold F for a long time. Right? I can go through and do this and it sounds a little bit more musical. So again, just something that you can keep in mind that you can add and it'll sound great with your neighbor. No one's going to give you stink eye. In fact, some people might look at you and go, "Oh, what are you doing?" Because it still sounds good with the group and it can enhance the sound of the song and help keep the jam more interesting and fun for yourself. So just again, you know, just thinking about some of the ways that you can add texture. And so doing things where you can walk up and down your neck, of course, is always a lot of fun and generally sounds really nice. Another thing that I also discuss, and I have discussed at length at past articles for Ukulele magazine, have been actually chord substitutions and the sort of easiest substitutions you can do right away that are going to sound great with your neighbor. And I have it. I like looking down because I want to make sure I'm citing the correct examples for you. Example number 4. If you have a C chord, I could play a C6, which is just all open strings. That sounds great, and that'll sound nice with your neighbor. If you want to be extra fancy pants, you could play the next inversion, which is not written down, but I'll show it to you right now. It's going to be barring that 2nd fret. I'm going to use my middle finger to cover the E and the A string on the 3rd fret, and then my ring is reaching over to that 4th fret on my C string. Now with this, I'm holding 2, 4, 3, and 3, okay? 2, 4, 3, and 3. This is C6 and another place. Keep that pencil in your hands because I'm going to show you one more that's a bit easier, but it doesn't move around as well as that one will. This particular one can move around up and down your fretboard because all the strings are covered. But this one, which reminds me of G minor, so it's open, 4, 5, and 3. So it looks a lot like if I had G minor and I moved it up. This is also a C6 chord as well. It has all the same notes as this. All the exact same notes. The only difference would be if you play low G, that G is going to be the lowest one in this version, okay? So with this, you could play C6, you could play C6, you could play C6. Those all sound great with your neighbor. There's another thing that you could play also, C major 7. This one, you kind of need to use your ear though, because it might not always sound good with your neighbor. And that's what I'm holding here with that second fret, open, 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 and 2. So with this, you can probably guess why it might not sound good with your neighbor. And the big thing is that when you play a regular C chord, if your neighbor's doing this, they're playing on the 3rd fret, you're going to be playing on the 2nd fret on the A string. So you're going to have a little bit of a grind happening because you have a half step difference between those two notes. Granted, you also have that same thing happening on the C string and the A string here, but because the C is an octave away, it's crunchy, but it's not going to be quite as much as if I was to do, actually it would be this. That's much more crunchy to my ear than this, right? So just food for thought on that for C major 7. You can generally use it, but just listen, and if you don't like how it sounds with your neighbor, maybe just try to use C major 7 when you're on your own and replacing all of your C's with that, just to see how it goes. I also cite minor chords as well. So when you have just a regular minor chord, my example I'm showing in the magazine is D minor, which is 2, 2, 1, and open, right? I can play this chord. It's a beautiful chord. I could play it in another place on my instrument. You know, I'm holding 7, 5, 5, 5. That's just a regular D minor chord up higher. But I could also try D minor 7. D minor 7 almost always sounds great with your neighbor, and that's 2, 2, 1, and all I'm doing is adding a finger on the A string, 3rd fret. So 2, 2, 1, and 3. It's a beautiful sound. It's lovely. If you wanted to play that in the next position up, it would be barring the 5th fret, which you're going to say, that looks like that F6 chord that you were showing earlier. It sure does. But talking about why those chords look the same and have different names is for another lesson. So again, D minor, I could play D minor 7. Then I could play D minor 6. All I'm going to do here is boop, bring my pinky down, and I'm holding 2, 2, 1, and 2. Now a D minor 6 sometimes doesn't always sound so good with your neighbor. So again, use your ear. You might find you really like that sound with your neighbor for certain songs, and then for other songs it may not work as well. So again, you know, use your ear, see what you think. Minor 7 is always a great way to go. That will always sound really nice versus the minor 6, but just know that either you can certainly try out at your jam, and it would add some new color and depth to the song itself. Now moving on, you could also throw in some dominant 9 chords. Anytime there's a dominant 7, or as you might know it, like G7, C7, right? The full technical name of that chord is a dominant 7 chord. And all we're doing is it's just a major chord with one extra note added. And when we make it a dominant 9 chord, that's generally going to sound good with your neighbors. There's other ways that you can alter that chord, but that is for a whole other series of lessons for altered dominant chords. But for now, if you're just trying to add and learn some new chords that sound friendly with your neighbor, try out 9s. And basically what you're doing on your ukulele for many of these dominant 9 chords is we're actually finding the root note of our chord. In this case, G7, it's my open G string, whether high G or low G. And you're gonna go a whole step up and add a finger right here. It means I need to rearrange my hand. So I'm gonna be holding 2, 2, 1, and 2, G9. I can play this while my neighbor plays G7, and it's gonna sound lovely. You're gonna also say, but isn't that also a D minor 6 chord? Yes. So Many chords are going to have lookalikes when you start getting into these more colorful chords. And the one thing I want you to kind of keep in mind and think about is that a chord name has the name because of the key you're in and the context of the chord, what comes before and after it. And as I mentioned earlier, that is for a whole other lesson. So in this context, 2212 is a G9 chord. Moving on, if I was to play a G7 in a new place, I'm going to hold that 4, 5, 3, 5. If I wanted to make this a 9 chord, I'd end up doing a double bar. You could do 1 finger per string if that's more comfortable for you, but you're going to end up holding 4, 5, 5, 5, okay? I prefer a double bar, but you have 4 fingers, there are 4 strings. You could do 4, 5, 5, 5 that way. Just watch out with your wrist and don't do any crazy bending like that. You really want to make sure your wrist is kept nice and straight. Okay, so I could use that 9 chord. So anytime there's a G7, I can make it a G9 chord. Same with my C7. If I was playing a regular old C7 and I needed to figure out, I could look up in my chord book, of course, C9, but the first chord inversion you're going to see of it is if I find my root, C, and I add a finger 2 frets up or a whole step up, open 2, open 1, that's a C9 chord. So that's just a sort of an easy trick, is find your root of your chord and then add a finger a whole step up. The one thing that does to your chord is it does make it rootless. But you know what? If your neighbor's playing a regular G7 or C7 and you go and play a G9 or a C9, together you are making a larger chord because they are playing the root and you are adding this extra piece of color right on top that sounds absolutely lovely. So again, when you're playing in a jam, you want to try to enhance it. You don't always necessarily want to play exactly what your neighbor is playing. So in doing this, it'll give you some really great options that will allow you to be able to add to it. Now, something else that you can also do that's just really fun is you can always do hammer-ons and pull-offs. One thing that I do recommend doing just in your spare time is just sitting with your instrument and holding a chord like C. And I want you to think about the scale notes that go into your C chord for a second. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Those are all notes found in your C major scale. And I want you to just find those notes while you're holding a C chord. I'm going to add the F note, which is the first fret of my E string. Take it away. Hammer that on. Pull it off. I'm going to add that G note now, even though I already have a G note in the chord, but I'm going to add it to that 3rd fret. Go back to the 1st fret of the E string. Take it away. I'm going to add the 2nd fret, which is a D note on my C string. I'm going to take it away. Now I'm going to add a B note to my A string, which means I'm going to change it up and I'm going to end up holding that 2nd fret. I'm going to take it away and I'm going to add it back. And then I'm going to go back to the C. And I'm going to go to the B note, which is on that string, and then the A, and back to the B. And I'm going to end on C. Now, all I was doing was just thinking about my C major scale and throwing in notes. Technically, I can tell you the names of all of the fancy pants chords I was playing, but I don't want you to think about chord names right now. I want you to just start manipulating chords that you already know that are under your fingers. Hammer-ons and pull-offs are a great way of doing that. And that little exercise I did there is something really easy that you can do with any chord. I'm going to hold G. All I'm doing is I'm adding my pinky to that 3rd fret. I'm taking it away, so I'm holding a G. I'm going to lift up the 2nd fret so it's an open A string. I can hammer it on, back on. hammered that on. Take it away. I pulled it off, and I'll pull off the next one. You know, and I can manipulate it further, but just on the A string alone, I can get a lot of cool stuff happening with my G chord. And again, I'm thinking, because I'm playing a G chord, I'm thinking of G major scale notes. And I'm just adding and taking away. And that's something that you can easily do in a jam, and it sounds great with your neighbor. You know, the examples that I cited here in the magazine, example 7 and example 8, like you can play them as this, but the main thing that I'm trying to get through for those is showing you, like, I'm playing a C scale backwards when you look at what's happening here. And so if I'm looking at the actual tablature and I'm trying to do, and I have us picking that 3rd fret and then, or, right? That's what's technically happening there. Again, I'll do. And that's just my C scale backward. That's all I'm doing. And I'm just being particular about, you know, holding the whole thing. And what would be best is if I actually held the 3 and the 2 together here on that A string, and I pull off, and then I'm holding my 3rd fret, I'm plucking it, and then I'm going to hold this guy, and then the 2nd fret, and I hit my open G string for high G just because I can. You can do it with the low G as it's written too, and then my C string, right, to end it. And you can mix and match and do whatever you'd like, but that's what that example is just a sort of reminder that you can change and manipulate your chord and add things like that in order to be able to, like, try out that technique while still holding and playing your chord. I do this also with the G example. So example 8. So in this one, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be adding my my pinky to that 3rd fret. And so you're going to see us doing where I'm pulling that all off. So again, it's pinky, pull, pull to the open A, and then I'm doing an open G. I prefer it with the high G, but you could do it as written with the low. And then strumming the whole thing through with the open A and hammering on the 2. So it sounds like this. Right? It kind of reminds me a little of James Taylor, a little bit, with this chord shape. Again, I'm doing, that's me using hammer-ons and pull-offs, manipulating the chord in order to be able to add to it. Yes, I'm playing, you know, we can go through and, like, minutely say, well, this is a G suspended to the G to the, you know, blah, 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 blah. But the thing is, I don't want you to think with that much of a microscope. You're playing a G chord and you're just removing and adding fingers and you're listening. If you remove a finger and it sounds terrible, or if you add on a finger and it sounds terrible, I guarantee you that if you move that a half step in either direction, you're going to find a good note. That's just the nature of our instrument. So for example, if I was holding that G chord, that sounds nice. I'll go one more. Not so nice. What if I go up one more? Sounds great. Back, no. Move it down. Sounds good. Sounds good. What if I do, ooh, that sounds real nice. What did I do there? So there, I just started messing with my E string. And I moved this down to, technically I made it a G major 7 chord. What if I did this? Not so good, but it sounds good a half a step here, right? Because that's that G again. So start trying things out. I want you to explore your instrument and don't get bogged down by the theoretical things. You can get so many cool sounds and so many great chords from this instrument if you just let your fingers try things out and let your ear listen and try things out. You might find you like some of those crunchy chords. You never know. And of course, if you're at a jam and you try something and it, makes your neighbor give you the stink eye, move a half step, And then I bet you'll blend in and sound great. You know, jams are a great place to try out new ideas and new techniques. Don't be afraid of, what your neighbor might think. You're all there making music and you're all learning. And I want you to really take this time to start using the things that have been, shown throughout this magazine over the years. There's so much great information. And if you haven't already been inspired to do so, go back and look at some of your past issues. You'll be surprised at how much amazing information there is in Ukulele magazine over the years. So thank you again so much for reading the magazine, for reading my article, joining me in this video. Thank you so much, Ukulele Magazine, and thank you, the viewer, for joining me on this really fun journey, making the jam a bit more fun for yourself.